All right, so it is 3:05, so I'll stop my share of our wonderful flyer overview, and I'll bring it to our faces. Thank you everyone for coming to our LinkedIn live event that is hosted on Zoom. I am fortunate to be here with Vicki Johnson from ProFellow. I'm assuming people will be joining in and out throughout this session, and so feel free if you have questions. Oh, are people struggling to hear? Okay. Tharsil, it might be your audio potentially. I know you joined from your phone, so it could be that. Let us know if you continue to struggle. This is also recorded too, so if anybody needs access to this afterwards, this is recorded. But if you have any questions during this time, you can feel free to drop them in the chat. But Vicki, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Can everyone hear me too? Is it all good?
I can hear you. Oh, hey, Derek.
Okay, so great. So it's great to be here. I love to talk about funding, especially funding for graduate school. So Yolanda, thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. I figure that we can kick off this session with just a little bit of overview about who we are. Especially, I'd love for you to give a little bit of overview of ProFellow, and then also to kick off even talking just a little bit about our experiences with funding in grad school. I know that it can vary a lot depending on your experience, and so I'd love for Vicki, for even you to kick it off with just a brief introduction of who you are.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm the founder and director of an organization called ProFellow. We are a social enterprise that's dedicated to helping people find and win fellowships and graduate school funding. And at ProFellow, we have a big, huge open access database with more than 2,500 fellowship and funding programs in there, and I'll talk a little bit about that today, about the different types of funding. But also myself too, the inspiration for founding ProFellow was just my own experience. First, I had found fellowships early in my career, professional fellowships that really helped launch my social impact career. But I did take out student debt for my master's, primarily because I didn't know where to find funding. I was looking in kind of the wrong places. I realized later in my life. But I did in my mid-30s, I received my PhD and I was able to get full funding for it, which was like a $250,000 funding offer. So now I teach other people how to find funding like that for their master's or doctoral degree.
Vicki, that's incredible. To find that much funding for a PhD program is huge. So I am Yolanda Marti. I'm the talent recruitment specialist at Leadership Brainery. We're a nonprofit that works to help underrepresented students gain access to the highest levels of education, so master's and doctoral degrees, because we believe that with greater resources and access to inclusive networks and advanced education, underrepresented students can leverage impactful and high wage paying careers and establish financial stability in order to reinvest back into their communities to create generational prosperity. So a lot of this talk around funding for grad school is important, especially with the barriers that can create in accessing advanced degrees. I was fortunate enough myself to receive a lot of support for my undergraduate degree through savings that my mom had racked up over the course of the time of me growing up. And then, additional scholarships on top of that, in addition to going to an in-state university for undergrad. And then for my master's degree, I just finished my master's in education at Boston University. And that was also, thankfully, I was able to finish debt-free due to additionally a scholarship from Teach for America, as well as some savings, again, that my mom had saved up for myself. So I know that that's a huge success story for me, and I know that that's not the experience for a lot of people. So I'm happy that we can spend some time here today talking about funding availability for other people that might not be as fortunate to be able to end up debt-free, especially. So I want to kick off this discussion. I figure, Vicki, you and I can go back and forth. So thank you for sharing your story and me with mine. I figure you can kick it off and we'll go from there.
Yeah. I have a question for you, Yolanda. What was your experience, when you were looking for funding for graduate school?
Yeah. So as I said, my mom had some savings, for me for grad school, but it wasn't covering the complete essence of what my degree would entail. It wasn't covering complete tuition. And I was looking at an entirely different level when applying to graduate school, mainly because I had gone through the undergraduate experience with my mother's help. But now looking at graduate school was a little bit of a different story, especially me being a working professional now. And so my experience looking for funding was unique in the sense that I did take part in the Teach for America program. And so they did provide me with additional support in seeking funding for graduate school. But beyond that, I really didn't know where to turn or what to do to look for funding. I was fortunate enough that I didn't have to do too much searching, but I know that in essence, a lot of the understanding that I had around graduate school funding was very small, if anything. There were a lot of things I didn't know, really. I didn't know, for example, that you can even negotiate a financial aid package that a school might offer you. I didn't know where you would start in finding that. I didn't even know really that there were fully funded options available, which is why it's so great to talk to you, because that's a crazy phenomenon I think a lot of people don't know. So those were some of the things that, my experience was unique, but there were a lot of things that I wish I had known going into the process as well.
Yes, me too. I feel like early in my career, I didn't really have any clear guidance on where to look for funding for grad school. And it wasn't until later that I realized that graduate school funding is very different than undergraduate funding. So I luckily, I grew up in a single income household. My dad was a Lutheran minister of like a small church. So grew up low income. And I was really fortunate to get a very substantial financial aid package from Cornell, which is where I went for my undergrad. So it was only through that financial aid that I was able to go to college. And also I worked while I was in school, like many people. But I didn't consider grad school until about 5 years after I graduated. And I, was thought I was doing the right thing. I was going on the internet. Now, this is 20 years ago. So the internet is certainly better than it was 20 years ago. But, I was Googling for scholarships, fellowships, which is something I knew about, financial aid, tuition assistance. And honestly, I was only finding like little awards, like $1,000 here, $2,000 there. So it really wasn't, none of the awards were anything that I thought this is going to like fully fund a degree. So for that reason, I always wanted to do a PhD, completely ruled it out at that early stage of my career because I thought there's no way I can pay for a 5-year degree. And I decided I would only apply for 1 or 2 year master's programs. And so, that's what I targeted. The other thing is that since I realized, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to take out the full amount in student debt. I mean, I had no personal savings at that early point in my career. I was really, I just decided I would go for really top schools because it had to be worth the investment. And ultimately, I was doing a master's in public health. And I ultimately ended up at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which is a 1 year master's program in the UK. Now, I did get into some other great schools like Johns Hopkins and Columbia, got into a program at Georgetown, but they were 2 year programs. And I was doing the math and I was like, the London School, because it was 1 year, was significantly cheaper overall. And then, I was able to, just cover that tuition through debt and loans. But it took me 15 years to pay off that student debt. So I think a lot of people don't really calculate, what the debt burden is going to be. It's just everyone's taking out student debt and we don't really do the math. So for someone like me working in public health, it was a little eye-opening when I came out like, oh, this is my monthly payment. I mean, it varied between $500 to $1,000 a month for many years. And I had a relatively small amount of funding. Uh, Now I could talk a little later about how I got full funding for the PhD, but um, maybe we should start with some of the other questions though too.
No, absolutely. I mean, my goodness, the amount that you pay sometimes when you have a loan, I mean, that's a car payment, right? That's
Oh
some
yeah.
people's mortgage payment. So when do you think that aspiring grad students should start researching their funding options? I mean, I know that, some people say, especially when you're a sophomore or junior in college, you think, I have all the time in the world to start thinking about funding. I have all the time in the world to start thinking about graduate school. But when do you think, that students should start thinking about that, even if they feel like it might be too early on?
Yes, actually, I think you have to research funding before you even decide what type of degree that you're going to go to, because um, depending on where the funding is, it could really make a huge difference in even the career track that you go into. So a lot of people want to apply for like a JD, go to law school, maybe go to medical school, or even the MBA, which is a really popular graduate degree, Master of Business Administration. And unfortunately, these types of degrees do result in a lot of student debt because there's limited funding for it. So I always say first, you should research where is the funding for grad school, especially if you're in any other field that does not require like a really specific degree. Lawyers need a JD, medical doctors need an MD. Got it. But virtually for all other fields, there is quite a bit of flexibility in the type of graduate degree that can help you achieve your career goals. So the reason I say look for funding first is that if you come to places like ProFellow and look at the differences in funding, you'll find that research-based master's degrees and doctoral degrees have a lot more funding options than professional degrees. So a research-based degree is a degree that results in like a master's thesis or a PhD dissertation. Professional degrees are more oriented to people who are in professional tracks. So if you're doing like a more professionally oriented master's, like Master of Social Work or MBA, that doesn't really have a thesis or research component, you'll find most of those degrees you have to pay for out of pocket. But if you kind of reorient yourself a little bit to the idea of doing a research-based degree, even to go into a non-research career track, suddenly it opens up a lot more funding options because organizations and universities, both external and internal, are funding research that's done by graduate students. So if you don't have research as a component in your degree, a lot less likely that you're going to be able to get funding. So I say you want to start doing that early so you can kind of see what I talk about a lot at ProFellow is two types of funding options. One is external fellowships. Like there are fellowships out there that could fund a significant portion of your degree. And there's even some that fully fund your degree. These are nationally competitive awards though. So there's not many of them compared to the number of people applying. The other category is fully funded master's and PhD programs. These are programs that offer full funding at acceptance to all of the students. And these are primarily full-time on-campus programs. So a research-based master's or the research-based PhD, there's tons of options. And in fact, at profellow.com, we have a database, a free database. There's 1,000 programs listed in there that offer full funding. So that's why I say, number one, research funding first, then start to really think more strategically about the type of degree if you want to make sure that you get a lot of funding.
Yeah, because I can see how you could be impressed by the amount of funding that's out there that you wouldn't even know to start looking at. So that's incredible. That's huge.
Yeah, Devin, and I'll just mention too about the timelines as well. A lot of people don't realize that they have to apply for funding at the same time that they apply to grad school if they want funding for their first year. So this is the time of year I get a lot of frantic emails from people like, I got into my top choice program. Where do I find funding? Unfortunately, it's too late. If you didn't get university funding, there isn't going to be external funding for something that's starting as soon as September. You could apply for funding for like the next academic year. But this is why you want to start early. So I say funding first, then choose your degrees. But let me punt it another question over to you. What do you normally hear from prospective graduate students that you work with regarding funding? What kind of barriers are they facing around funding?
100%. So as I said, at Leadership Brainery, we work to increase access to those degrees, right? So we work with a lot of students, whether they be in school and undergrad or working professionals, and we're helping them through the process of even exploring that graduate school is an option for them. And one of the things we hear a lot is honestly that funding is an initial barrier to them even considering graduate school as an option. I know that a lot of people will get through undergrad, especially if you fund it yourself. And so you get through undergrad, you graduate, you finish, and you go, yes, I'm never doing that again, ever. And so they get a job, and then end up realizing later on that to get access to leadership positions within those jobs that they have or those occupations, they need a graduate degree. But then the initial barrier that they have to deal with is, especially some working professionals might have additional financial constraints at that point. They might have had children and now are considering going to graduate school. They might be, paying for a house, have a mortgage. And so that funding barrier then becomes an even greater insurmountable barrier to get to graduate school. on top of the fact that even that's funding your tuition. We are not even talking about the funding that goes into the preliminary aspects of even applying to graduate school. I mean, you have interviews, you have your seat deposit, travel fees, potentially your application fees, test preparation, which is a huge barrier. I'm even right now studying for the LSAT to apply to law school, and the amount of financial constraints that I have even right now is huge. And so we hear from a lot of students that not only is it a barrier to them considering graduate school, but then we just had a student a little while ago that got accepted to the school of his dreams, was very excited, and realized that he didn't have the money to pay for his seat deposit. And so now you're in this barrier of, I've overcome the hurdle of considering graduate school. Now I'm in this position, but I'm struggling to even make it through the front door. And so I think that, you know, these conversations are important to be had, especially because you don't realize what types of barriers finances might be preventing you from even exploring what other resources might be available to you. So it's huge. It's a huge problem.
Yeah, that was good to mention. There are expenses just to apply and get into the schools. I do want to encourage people, like when there's application fees, and if you have a financial barrier, there's no reason you can't reach out to the school and see if they'll waive the fee due to financial need. And especially if you're an international student, they often will do that. Good news is a lot of schools are dropping test requirements. I saw this during the pandemic, but even before the pandemic. So it wasn't even just the logistics of taking tests, but also, you know, a lot of the schools are realizing that things like test scores, like GRE, is not a good indicator of success in grad school. So that's like another reason that they're dropping it, which is good news for all of us. So if you were looking at grad school 2 years ago and were kind of held off by the whole GRE requirement cost and just, you know, the undertaking of it, look again. You might be surprised to find a lot of the schools that you were interested in don't have that. But it's true, there is those kind of fees that you kind of need to put some money aside for.
Yeah. And I mean, even too, back to your earlier point, don't be afraid to look for opportunities to receive fee waivers elsewhere as well. I mean, at Leadership Brainery, we've been given the amazing opportunity to offer fee waivers to students, even vouchers to cover part of the fees for their tests, or in our Leadership Brainery Ambassador Fellowship, which I'll touch on in a little bit, you know, offering fully funded test prep as well. So look for those opportunities to get funding from external sources as well, because the opportunities are out there. I think a lot of the times, especially as underrepresented or underserved students, we don't oftentimes realize that there are people out there that are willing to help us. And so I think that it's very, very important to recognize that there are institutions out there that are looking to give you the opportunity to reach your goals. And so don't be afraid to ask for help, and don't be afraid to recognize when you might need that external resource. But on that note, Vicki, what would you say are the best ways for people to find the really big sources of funding for graduate school? So say they've overcome those initial hurdles of test prep, they've overcome the application fee, but now, you know, they have that really big debt that they might be, you know, looking to attain. So what are the big sources of funding, and how can they look for those?
Yes, this is a topic I love to talk about because honestly, I didn't have this information myself until my mid-30s. You know, I was tapped by a professor to apply to a PhD program, and only because he told me we offer full funding that I understood, or had first heard of the word full funding. This is after going to an Ivy League undergrad, having done fellowships, been working in DC and those kind of circles. I still had never heard of it. So now I teach this far and wide. There are universities that offer full funding at acceptance. And when you hear the word full funding, what they're talking about is a graduate assistantship. This is a part-time researcher teaching position that is exclusively for graduate students. It means that when you come on as a full-time student, if you get an assistantship, you might be working 10 to 20 hours per week, supporting faculty, teaching classes. And in exchange for this assistantship role, this part-time role, you will get a stipend. The annual stipends range from anywhere from like $15,000 a year to $45,000 US per year, plus the employment benefit of free tuition. So you get a full tuition waiver. Now, this is most commonly found in PhD programs, 5-year research-based PhD programs, but you can find master's programs that offer assistantships too. And like I was mentioning previously, these are more research-oriented master's programs. So they typically result in a master's thesis. And that's why I really try to catch people before they apply to grad school to say, look, no matter what type of graduate degree you're considering, you really should look at all of the options in your discipline. So for example, let's say you had your heart set on an MBA, you're working in the corporate track or consulting, that's fine. But you could, MBAs are expensive. You're going to pay probably for a lot of it out of pocket. You could get an alternative degree. What if about a master's in data science, master's in communication, master's in finance? Those kind of degrees can also be really valuable in any kind of corporate track that you're in. Likewise, in other fields, if you're doing a Master of Social Work, Master of Education, Master of Public Health, there are some of those master's programs in the same exact discipline. Some of them will be professionally oriented, meaning they have primarily coursework, maybe a capstone project, but there will be other ones that are more research oriented, teaching research methods, having a research thesis, and those are more likely to have assistantships. So the reason I was able to get a $250,000 valued package is that the university offered me an assistantship when I enrolled. So I did a bit of work for the faculty, and in exchange, they covered my full tuition for the doctoral program, and I got a $25,000 a year stipend. So, I mean, the stipends aren't lots of money. So it's kind of like, I know some people are like, well, you know, that's not enough to live on. But keep in mind, the alternative is also then taking out tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars in student debt, while also maybe not working or working less. So if many people kind of go, well, I'll work part-time, you know, I'll go to school part-time, or I'll do one of these cheaper online degrees. You know, even the online degrees are going to cost you 20, 40, 50, up to $80,000 out of pocket. So those are not small amount of money, small amounts. The other benefit to looking at these fully funded research-based programs is research is a skill that is valued in all industries. It actually can help you get jobs. So no matter if you're working in the corporate world, the nonprofit world, government, consulting, freelancing, entrepreneurship, you know, knowing how to do research is a great skill and actually can help you stand out as a job candidate. So why not consider a research-based degree and come out with no student debt, and then you can pursue the job that you want versus the job that you need to pay down your student debt. So that's why I say number one is looking at fully funded programs. And like at ProFellow, we have more than 1,000 listed. There's tons of content, and then there's even more than that. We have just shipped the iceberg of fully funded programs because they're not easy to find. So you want to look at those words like full funding, fully funded, and assistantships. Now, on the other side, there is also external fellowships. I always say fellowships, they're out there. You know, there's the Paul and Daisy Soros Foundation fellowships, the Thomas R. Pickering fellowships. There is some great fellowships, but they're not a good strategy for funding grad school because they're nationally competitive. By nature, they give out very few awards compared to the number of people applying. And so just by nature, they're harder to get. It's harder to get a nationally competitive fellowship than it is to get, you know, into a fully funded graduate program. So that's why I say look at both options. If you're a competitive candidate, there are some amazing fellowships. You want to look at them early, like in this time frame, because you'll be applying to them at the same time that you apply to grad school if you want to get the funding for that first year. But those are kind of the two big buckets. And I say you want to look now before you apply. Do not wait to look for funding, until after you get your acceptance. Because at that point, if you didn't get funding from the university, it's too late to get external funding. So that's why I love to share information about fully funded programs. It was super eye-opening for me. So I hope some of you here might consider that option.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that one of even the other barriers that we hear from students is that they don't know, you've heard again about the MBA, you've heard about your JD, you've heard about your MD, but students don't realize the plethora of graduate degrees that are available to you beyond those. So, no shame to anybody who pursues those degrees, right? As I said, I'm hoping to go for my JD. But it is important to also understand that there are other degrees available to you that could potentially even fit your niche closer than what, one of those professional degrees might offer you. So that's why even at Leadership Brainery, we have our online platform, Dear Future Colleague, and students can search degrees and jobs on that platform, which offers them the opportunity to explore, right, the variety of different degrees. Because again, as you've mentioned many times during even this call, the resources are not readily available as much as they should be. People are not having these conversations as much as they should be. And a lot of us even sometimes come from families and backgrounds in which our parents didn't go to graduate school, our grandparents didn't go. And so now I don't have anybody to turn to for that support. So opportunities and resources like ProFellow, like Leadership Brainery, and others are things that anybody on this call, anybody watching the recording after this call, should lean on to make sure that you have that additional support, 100%.
And this brought me up something too. I just want to mention that what a lot of people don't realize too is that at the graduate level, it's not really such thing as financial need at the graduate level. There is, in some cases, schools that might provide financially oriented scholarships or fellowships. Usually these are more reserved for, say, international students who are coming from, countries that have a totally different income differential to the US. But if you're expecting to get financial aid, the thing is at the master's and doctoral level, you're considered an income, generating adult at this point. So it's not like you're not going to find financial aid like you see at the undergraduate level when you're coming out of high school, and you're a young person with no work experience. So that's why a lot of people think, oh, there's going to be financial aid, but it's not really like that at the graduate level. So you're an adult and they expect that you're going to figure out a way to pay for this. So and also keep in mind, there's a big marketing mechanism out there now. A lot of schools and universities are also selling graduate degrees. So you have to be really discerning around, the quality of the degree, the career outcomes from the degree. Even if you get into a fully funded program, you still have to think about the time investment. Is this going to result in a higher salary? Is this going to result in job outcomes? Because if you don't really have that information, I don't know that graduate school is a good investment. So you really think of it as an investment. What am I going to get out of this degree? Because whatever time and money you put into it, it really has to pay off on the other end. And sorry, one more quick thing. JDs, you can also do a joint JD PhD or joint MD PhD as a way to get full funding for your law degree. I don't know if you thought about that, Yolanda.
Listen, I might need to hop on another call with you after this and talk about that.
We'll get on another call. I mean, it's a little more schooling, but you might get full funding that way too. But enough, I've talked enough. Let me get to a question for you, Yolanda. I wanted to ask you about the Leadership Brainery Fellowship. Can you speak a bit about that and the funding component that's involved?
100%. So yes, so at Leadership Brainery, I've already mentioned our online platform, Dear Future Colleague, but we are currently in the application cycle for our Ambassador Fellowship. This is our third cohort of our Ambassador Fellowship. And it is an 18-month program for current sophomores of color in the greater Boston area. So it has been national in the past, but now we're really centering it to the greater Boston area to provide mentorship, one-on-one coaching for graduate school. And this year, we actually are privileged enough to offer $10,000 scholarships to every student that is admitted into our cohort. And so it's important also to, I think, talk about too, a lot of the funding components that you might see apply directly to tuition, which is the largest amount of debt that you would take on, right? The largest financial barrier. But then after you've covered your tuition, a lot of the times you also experience additional barriers, such as barriers to housing stability, barriers to funding for things like transportation, clothes, food. And so the Ambassador Fellowship is really positioned to offer students, in addition to any other funding that they receive, the opportunity to have $10,000 that they can put towards any additional barriers they might see for graduate school. So we're privileged enough to offer that this year. It's very exciting. And additionally, as part of the fellowship, we do offer fully funded test preparation. And a lot of the schools that Leadership Brainery partners with also offer fee waivers. So making sure that the amount of debt that you might incur is not a barrier to you considering graduate school as an option. I also think it's important to note, based on our previous conversations about when students should start looking, your sophomore year is a critical time for you to start planning your next steps, whether that be funding, whether that be graduate school. It's not too early. If anything, college goes fast. My mom used to tell me that all the time. Your 4 years will fly by, and they do. And so I think that it's important for students to recognize how critical your sophomore year, that time, especially sophomore, junior year, is to planning your next steps. You don't want to reach your senior year and be thinking about graduate school. Oh, now you have to delay it a year or two. So really utilize the time in college that you have to plan ahead for your next steps, funding included. and make sure that you're really positioning yourself in the best available opportunity for you to pursue your next steps, I think is so important.
Really good tips.
Of course. I wish I had had the ambassador fellowship around when I was even exploring my next steps too, because my sophomore year, I had no idea. If you would have asked Yolanda sophomore year what she wanted to do, I wanted to go straight into law school after undergrad. Obviously, my plans changed a little bit, but I didn't even have that support, right, to get to my next step. So I wish I would have had this sort of program when I was in undergrad. The last question I'll ask you, Vicki, is how can a student best prepare to be a competitive applicant to graduate schools that offer funding? Just because, you know, it's one thing to talk about the funding, but it's another thing to actually set yourself up to be the best candidate for these schools. So what would you recommend?
Yes. So knowing now that you guys know that, you know, the research-based programs are where the big funding awards are, it's good to get as much research experience as you can, as early as you can. So I'll be honest, when I was an undergrad, I didn't have any research experience. I wasn't even an honor student. But I was able to get research-like experience from my policy work in DC. So if you're an enrolled student, I would encourage you to seek out opportunities to get research experience. If you're in a position to do a senior thesis, do it. If you can get a summer undergraduate research fellowship or take some of your electives or core classes in research methods, I would do that because it'll make you a better candidate for research-based master's and PhD programs. And also, by the way, there's lots of summer fellowships listed in the ProFellow database too, some of which could give you kind of a seminal research experience. If you're already out in the work world and you're like, oh no, I didn't get any research experience, you can also really think about how you could get research experience through your work. So anything that involves coming up with a research question, collecting data or information, and analyzing that information is research by nature. So even if it doesn't result in an academic science, you know, article or report, it doesn't necessarily mean that you lack research experience. So think about in your corporate work, your nonprofit work, your policy work, your teaching work, how you're collecting data and analyzing data, because you can actually sort of couch that in your application as research experience. Another key thing is build relationships with professors. I know we're in the virtual world now. The pandemic put a huge pall over like academic study, but I've heard more and more universities say, oh, it's so hard to get students to show up for events and, you know, to come to office hours. You know, I would encourage you all to really, you know, try to put the foot back on the pedal with those kind of things, those opportunities. Go to your professor's office hours, whether they're in person or, you know, virtual, because you need to build relationships with professors. Even if you're not planning to apply to graduate school for 3, 4, 5 years or have no idea, develop those relationships because you may need to reach back out to them for recommendation letters. And so if they've never met you and have no idea who you are, it's going to be really hard to, who are you going to ask for rec letters from? So make those relationships, ask your professors as well. Hey, I need some research experience on my resume. How can I get that? Do you have any opportunities where I can volunteer and assist you with your work? There's so many ways to get yourself in front of folks. Also, likewise, with the graduate schools, go to info sessions, go to graduate school fairs, meet with admissions representatives. You know, when we're in election season and you go around your locality and there's billboards with people's names on them, and you see the same names over and over and over again, you know, but there's other names that you never see. And so when you get to the ballot, you're sort of like drawn to the names that you've seen on those billboards. It's the same psychological process with admissions. If they've never seen your name or face and you're just submitting your written application, there's nothing for them. They don't know you. They don't remember you. There is a psychological aspect to going and getting yourself in front of admissions representatives. So go to the grad school fairs, virtual and in person. Go to those info sessions. Introduce yourself. Tell them about the program. Ask them questions. I can't even tell you how much that enthusiasm and that sort of go-getterness really makes a difference, especially if you're trying to overcome factors like maybe a lower GPA, a not so great test score, a blemish, a kind of a weak recommendation letter. If you have any of those challenges, they really can be overcome through relationships and networking. You know, it's just like, you know, these are humans too that are selecting their next cohort of students. So they see your name and face. They're like, yeah, Yolanda, I remember her. She came to like every info session. Oh my gosh, she's like the biggest fan of our program. We got to take her in. So I feel like that makes a big difference. And I also have like a million other application tips, but uh, well, I can't do it all here, but those are just a few key ones. And
No,
Yolanda, how about you? What do you say?
I was gonna say, I think those are huge. The relationship building piece is essential. I mean, we tell students all the time, the admissions people that you're emailing with that general admissions email, they're real people. And if you get the opportunity to get in contact with an admissions representative, even ask them if they're willing to meet up with you for coffee, if they're willing to meet up with you and actually have a conversation about the graduate program that you're interested in. A lot of the times, even schools might offer opportunities to shadow a class. So if you have that opportunity, go sit in a class and have that experience, because it's very true. Sometimes even if they forget your name, a lot of people will, they'll remember the face, right? They'll remember your face and they'll see you often enough that they'll start, asking you questions and building that relationship with you. So it is so, so important to take advantage of those relationships if you absolutely can, especially now in this virtual world that we live in. I think that's huge, especially too, right? Take advantage of as much time as you can. Go to those resume workshops that your school is hosting that you think you don't need. Go to those. Go to the workshops where they'll help you build your cover letters or your application materials. Utilize all of the resources to your advantage to really formulate as much of the package as you can ahead of time. Make sure to learn the aspects of yourself that make you marketable too. I think that's huge. I just had a conversation with a student today about the fact that don't ever discredit yourself and the experiences you have, because schools need you. Schools need your resources. They need your insight, your intellect. And so don't ever discredit yourself from an application cycle. If anything, learn how to market yourself to the best of your ability, because all of you on this call and all of you that are not on the call have qualities about yourself that schools need. So you just need to really hone in on what those aspects are. But Vicki, you mentioned that you have other resources that you can't mention on this call, but I think I heard that you might have a webinar coming up at some point.
Yes, I have. You know what? And I'm silly because do you have the link available?
I do.
On your Google
I'll drop it in the chat.
On May. I'm doing, it's the same event. I'm giving it on May 11th and on May 18th on how to achieve a top graduate degree debt-free. And I'm going to tell you what I call my Match Me formula. It's really, it's what I call the 7 elements of a winning application. So I'm going to kind of go deep on, things that really make applications stand out. And this is because I've actually mentored, I have my own group coaching program for graduate school applicants. And I've been able to help a lot of people who have all sorts of challenges, mid-career. I've been out of school for ages. I have a low GPA, imposter syndrome, unable to identify funding. There's so many ways to create an exceptional application that has nothing to do with your GPA or your test score. And what Yolanda said is really true about universities are looking to create diverse and dynamic cohorts of students. And they are humans. They're picking you based on very human factors, feelings about your applications, and just seeing your face at these info sessions. So I wouldn't beat yourself up about any kind of, oh, my GPA is this or that. That's actually not what they're truly selecting people on. It's actually on different factors. So I'm going to talk a lot about this in this upcoming webinar. And so if you want to hear more about what the 7 elements of a winning application is for these fully funded programs, please come. And I'll also, be sharing there too the ProFellow.com database, which you can get into now. And I'll put that link in the chat, ProFellow, so that you can get your free account, sign up, and check out our database.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
And I think, and you have something as well, right? You're going to share in the chat your the fellowship link.
Yes.
I want to make sure they get that too.
I want to take a second that if anyone on this Zoom session, or anyone who watches the recording later, is a current sophomore in the Boston area and is interested in graduate school, we are still accepting applications for our fellowship. So I'm going to drop the link to the fellowship in the chat. Our application deadline is June 1st. So let me see, there'll be Ambassador Fellowship. So if you have any additional resources that you need, if you're interested in graduate school, definitely apply. As I said, current sophomores of color in the Boston area. And of course, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. So if you go to Leadership Brainery, you can see contact information as well and reach out. But I know that we're running close to the end of this session, and I want to give time for anybody on this call that has questions for Vicki or myself. You can drop them in the chat, especially if we don't get to all of the questions, we can get in contact with you outside. So if anybody has any additional questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat. We'll take a couple of minutes to go over those, and then we'll end the session. Oh, and I'm sorry, also, while people are thinking of your questions, also mention too, as you might have heard me say before, Leadership Brainery also has an online platform called Dear Future Colleagues. So if you need additional support for graduate school and you're not a current sophomore in the Boston area, Dear Future Colleague accepts members from anywhere across the country. So if you are interested in graduate school and you're, say, a junior or a senior and you're looking for extra assistance, you can sign up at Dear Future Colleague. So I'll also drop that link in the chat as well.
I do want to mention, I did get a direct message question that I can answer. I don't know if the rest can see it, but someone was asking about age limits with some fellowships and an approach. And this person was interested in doing a doctorate in public health. So I will mention that, we have hundreds of master's and doctoral fellowships listed at ProFellow. And most of them don't have age limits. Now, there are fellowships that are geared toward recent graduates, early career folks, but you would be surprised to find that most of the fellowships do not have an age or work experience kind of requirement or limit. So there's plenty of awards for people of all ages. And especially for the graduate funding fellowships, they don't really care about your age. It's more that, are you enrolled in a program in a discipline that's in alignment with the research funding body? So I would say, like in public health, there is public health fellowships that could provide graduate funding that don't have any age limits. But also too, just again, if you're looking at a doctorate of public health, the DRPH, I would also strongly encourage you to look at the PhD in public health, because the doctorate of public health is professionally oriented. So very few programs offer funding. I think I've heard that Harvard offers funding, but for the most part, professional doctorates are not funded. So in any field of discipline that you're in, also look at the PhD version of your degree. This will be a research-oriented degree. It is more geared toward people who are going into academic career tracks, becoming professors. However, that does not mean that you can't do a PhD and then work in other fields: public health, government, nonprofit, policy, teaching, whatever you choose. So I always say, look at the PhD version of any discipline for the
Thanks.
funding. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, and I see a thank you in the chat too, of course.
All right.
Last call for any additional questions for us. Of course, Vicki and I are both on LinkedIn. So you can connect with us on LinkedIn and ask us any questions, or like I said before, Vicki on ProFellow and myself, either Dear Future Colleague or the Ambassador Fellowship are both opportunities to explore connecting with our programs further than this session. So thank you so much to everybody who came in attendance, and thank you to everybody who might be watching the recording later. We are here to support you in all of your endeavors. So go on and be great, but know that there are people out there who are trying to help you be the best that you can be. So thanks so much. And thank you, Vicki, for joining me as well.
Oh, thank you, Yolanda, for having me. I always love talking about this.